Williamsburg is as close to her hometown as Martha Washington would ever get. She was connected with this place from even well before she was born. Her great-grandfather, Roland Jones, was the first rector of Bruton Parish Church from about 1664 to 1688. You can't get more embedded in the life of this town than that. Her grandfather, Orlando Jones, we have his house that is reconstructed here on Duke of Gloucester Street, and they owned a plantation at Queens Creek, just right outside of town. And then their daughter, Frances, married John Dandridge, who was an up-and-coming planter, and they moved out to New Kent County, which is probably no more than 30 miles away. And that's where Martha was. That's where Martha was born, at Chestnut Grove. And her growing up there, Williamsburg was then the center of political and social and cultural life in all of Virginia, but certainly in this part of Virginia. And so, given the fact that her father was engaged in a lot of political and economic activity, this is the place where she would have come to more often than any other place.
This was the area where she kind of was born to, because if you were anyone in society, you came to Williamsburg if you were from New Kent. Her mother, certainly being of Williamsburg society, when she became of the age where she was being brought into society, she was being brought to the balls and the assemblies here. She was at the balls at the Royal Governor's Palace. She was certainly at the assemblies at places like the Raleigh Tavern. So when it's time to be brought out into polite society, Williamsburg was the place to be, because her mother knew that Williamsburg was where her daughter needed to be. Martha falls in love with Daniel Custis. That's her first husband, who she knows is a farmer, a plantation owner, a man of New Kent. But what she doesn't know is that Daniel Custis is the son of John Custis, who owns 7 properties here in Williamsburg, all the northern neck, most of the eastern shore. And she falls in love with his son Daniel, thinking he's just this man from New Kent. And when Daniel goes to his father and says, "I want to marry Martha Dandridge," John Custis basically says, "Oh, her family's not fortunate enough to marry into the Custises." And he said no. But the Dandridges were well known. Her father was a clerk of New Kent. Martha was well known for her amiable personality. It was that warm nature that people really fell in love with her. So John Blair and John Proctor go to John Custis on Martha's behalf and says, "If you just meet this girl, you'll change your mind about her." And I'd love to go back in history and find out what the meeting between John Custis and Martha Dandridge was like, because whatever she said to this man, he said she was the most amiable young girl, and he could not see his son marrying anything better than the young Dandridge girl.
I think we can kind of see Williamsburg as her proper home away from home. I mean, this is the place where she owned property. She owned a house in which her first husband and her children are buried right outside of town. All of her family, her closest members of her family, are within 20 or 30 miles of Williamsburg, so she can easily reconnect with them. We're at Bruton Parish Church in Williamsburg, which actually, in many ways, is Martha Washington's home church. Her great-grandfather was the first minister of Bruton Parish Church, Roland Jones. He's buried on the inside. Her grandparents, Orlando Jones and his wife, they're both buried here inside the church, and probably more closely connected to with Martha Washington than anybody else other than George Washington is her first husband and their first 2 children. This is the final resting place of Daniel Park Custis, Martha Washington's first husband. This particular stone was ordered for him from London, and although he and both of their first 2 children, their first son and their first daughter, who lie here, were first interred at their plantation outside of Williamsburg, their remains and these stones were moved here to basically her family church in the early part of the 20th century. Well, this is the Custis tenement. This is one of the buildings that Martha Washington owned here in Williamsburg. In fact, she owned most of this whole block going back a couple of acres, which means she owned a huge chunk of what Williamsburg was. Martha Washington stayed here throughout
off and on throughout most of her life, because Williamsburg was the political, social, and cultural center of her world. And so she was here when her husband, Daniel Parke Custis, was a prominent member of this community. And of course, she was here very often when George Washington was a member of the House of Burgesses, when he was a political leader in the colony, and of course, in order to be able to protect and promote her own business interests in the area. When she was staying here, she'd be engaging in most of the prominent social and cultural activities of the period, whether it was actually going to balls over at the governor's palace, which she can see from the front door of her house, or whether it's engaging with the other political leaders of the colonies and holding dinner, or in making sure that she's going to all of the shops and everything that are up and down Duke of Gloucester Street. She's going to be engaged in almost everything that makes colonial Williamsburg then and now such a vibrant place.